Think forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
Top school problems. You know, when I first started working on this back in the early 1990s, there was a survey that came out that some of you saw. And this survey talked about the top problems in the 1940s, such dreadful problems as talking and gum chewing and making noise. And you might also recall that another survey came out that said that the top problems then were drug abuse, violence, and pregnancy. And this was a pretty frightening, compelling survey, extraordinarily discrepant results. And in fact, this survey was publicized on all the major television networks. It was presented in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Newsweek and Time did feature stories on this survey and its significance. I was certainly envious of a researcher who'd been able to do such a well-known and widely publicized survey. And so was another academic, a professor of marketing actually at Barry O'Neill, who tried to trace down and find out where that survey came from, because none of these authorities who reported the survey actually said where it came from. And he discovered that the survey actually was an invention of a Texas oil businessman who was opposed to public schools and who developed the survey himself, and of course it was wildly successful. What did T. Cullen Davis say? They weren't done from a scientific survey. How did I know what the offenses in the schools were in 1940? I was there. How do I know what they are now? I read the newspapers. In working on the book School Violence, Fears versus Facts, I discovered that this survey this may have been the best example, but it wasn't the only one. That in fact there is a lot of data out there, a lot of misinformation, a lot of extrapolations from surveys that are erroneous. And one of the most common is to claim that there are 135,000 guns brought to school every day. And in fact, if you Google 135,000 guns, there's over 100 websites that tout this statistic. Many prestigious, respectable organizations cite this finding. I tried to figure out where it came from. They all cite different sources. I spent months calling folks, tracking people down, trying to find out where this survey came from. The Adolescent Health Survey in 1987, now mind you, 20 years ago, this survey was conducted on 8th grade and 10th grade students, and it had the question, while at school, how often did you carry a handgun? Okay, this is a terrific question to ask 8th graders, as you might imagine. Okay, and in fact, 0.8% said nearly every day. Okay, now I have to think, when I was an 8th grader, if they had given me a survey that said, have you brought a bazooka to school? I would have said yes, of course, all the time, you know, just to be difficult. And so it's not surprising that 0.8% of any group of 8th and 10th grade students might in fact say yes to some question like that. And then staff in an unrelated National Center on School Safety, someone there, and they won't say who because they're kind of embarrassed that it came from them, but they did sort of own up to it, talking to a reporter said, well, if 0.8% bring a gun to school every day, we can multiply that by the number of high school age students or teenage students, and we come up with 135,000. Okay? So this number is still prevalent today, even though at best it's 20 years out of date, and it's certainly going to be erroneous. We also have had the school shootings, the rampage school shootings of the 1990s that have continued to the present day intermittently, have gotten a lot of attention, and they've stimulated a lot of fear and concern. Fear that has been, I think, magnified by the tabloid approach that the news media originally took. The monsters next door, cold-blooded evil children, teen violence, wild in the streets, okay? Language and images that are extremely compelling, fears that are aroused and overwhelm the sort of factual approach that we might take or that I would advocate that we take. Because even at the time in which the general public thought that schools were getting dangerous, that young people were more violent, that we had a crime wave of super predators, one authority said. In fact, it was just the opposite. During the 1990s, juvenile violence declined markedly. So why did violent juvenile crime decline? There are a number of factors. This has been widely written about and discussed and debated. Certainly economic improvement was important, particularly economic improvement that increases employment opportunities for young adults, raises the minimum wage, and particularly economic improvement that benefits single parents. Because as it turns out, if single parents can earn more money, fewer of them will be taking a second or third job, more of them will be available to supervise their children after school. Turns out that after-school supervision is really a critical factor on youth violence. Certainly we had improvements in law enforcement, community-oriented policing, and the response to the crack market and to juvenile gangs. We're talking also about improvements in education. Educators are probably last but not least to get credit for the decline in youth violence. And they get credit, I think, for the thousands of programs that have been implemented in schools to teach people how to resolve conflicts, how to avoid drugs, gangs, and weapons. Now, recently we've had some more school shootings in the United States, and this has aroused again fear that we're seeing some type of increase. Every reporter that's contacted me starts off by asking me, aren't you concerned about the increase in school violence? And I have to say, what increase are you talking about? And they say, well, what about the shooting in Colorado? What about the shooting in Pennsylvania? I said, okay, that's 2. How is that an increase? And often such conversations don't go much further if I don't have something to say about, how scary and frightening things are. But certainly this was a terrible, tragic shooting. It's very heart-rending, and it's certainly something that we would like to try to prevent. But it doesn't signal some type of massive change in the safety of children in our schools. All of this fear has created the perception that schools are dangerous places, even though all of the data says that schools are actually among the safest places for kids to be. Far more violent crimes take place in homes and residences than anywhere else, or on the street, or in office buildings, okay? And last, but way down the list, is violence in schools. Now, we've used this term school violence. We talk about school violence, we talk about school shooters. We've created a new category of event, and we've created a new category of crime and criminal because of this attention to this term school violence. And that's very unfortunate because it reifies it and it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling, self-perpetrating idea. What are the causes of death for young people? Well, young people, as you can see, are at some risk of being shot at school. And in 1999, the year of the Columbine shooting, when 3/4 of American parents in a Gallup poll thought that such a shooting could occur at their child's high school, in fact, only 17 young people were killed in schools. Far more died of the flu or pneumonia. And Far more died of accidents, typically automobile accidents. So if we really want to protect our young people, we need to convince them to wear their seat belts and not to drink and drive. Okay? But that's not very sensational. That's kind of old news. But statistically, that's going to save far more lives. During the 10 worst years, we had 93 total student homicides. That is 93 times that a student came into school and killed somebody. Well, this works out to 9.3 per year, but we've got 119,000 schools. So in a given year, we have 9 of these shootings that result in fatalities, but we have 118,991 schools that don't have a shooting. So how long is it going to take? What's the probability that it's actually going to occur in your school or in the average school? Okay, we divide this out. It turns out to be about 78 millionths. Very remote probability. No one's going to bet on a horse with odds like this, right? Well, we can convert this into a rate. Okay? The average school can expect a homicide by a student every 12,000 years. So we're preparing for an event that is extraordinarily unlikely to happen. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about school safety or school violence, but I'm not as much concerned about a student killing somebody as I am the other types of violence and disruptive behavior that we see in our schools. And as long as we think that there might be a school shooting in our school, we're going to treat children very differently. We're going to perceive them as more dangerous than they actually are. Okay? This has been the effect of Columbine, the legacy of Columbine, to think that a lot of our kids are just like those 2 boys and are going to commit a similar act of violence. Okay? And by that I mean the expansion of zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is an example of a good idea gone bad. Zero tolerance for guns, for drugs. Who can be opposed to that? Certainly a politically very popular idea. But after Columbine, zero tolerance went on steroids. Zero tolerance was expanded to cover all sorts of events that are not truly dangerous. So we outlawed toy guns and nail clippers and plastic utensils. Even kids who pointed their finger and went pow pow in some school districts were suspended. In some they were actually arrested and expelled from school. And we've seen all over Virginia and all over the country many cases of young people who have been subjected to zero tolerance based on fear. So we had a 10-year-old who accidentally brought his G.I. Joe toy gun, a little 1-inch piece of plastic that he left in his pocket. He turned it into his teacher because he knew he wasn't allowed to have toy guns at school. That was a big mistake because the teacher turned it over to the principal. The principal said, the school board says, mandatory expulsion for any type of toy gun, regardless of size, shape, or what have you. So because of this 1-inch piece of plastic, he was expelled from school. I hear these stories frequently. I have parents who call me anguished, upset, distraught, saying, you know, my child, you know, is a Boy Scout and he went camping over the weekend and he left his pack in his car. And they did a search of the parking lot and somebody saw that he had a Boy Scout knife in his car and now he's out of school. Now he's expelled. Okay? These sorts of stories we hear with too much frequency. So what's wrong with zero tolerance? Zero tolerance gives schools no flexibility, no ability to consider the context or the meaning of the child's behavior. There's actually no evidence that increases safety. There's a task force at the American Psychological Association that recently released a report showing no evidence that zero tolerance makes schools safer. And in fact, I'm concerned that it has the opposite effect because it shuts down communication. It makes kids unwilling to come forward, okay, when they're concerned about a dangerous situation. So if we add up these zeros, my conclusion is that it has zero value as a school policy. I'm not the only one, of course, with this view. Many organizations, the American Bar Association, the ACLU, the Rutherford Institute, these organizations, which are at the extreme left and the extreme right, are both opposed to zero tolerance. Both of them have filed lawsuits against schools for zero tolerance. You know you've got a problem when both the left and the right are suing you for the same basic problem. Okay? Our national education organizations still or have continued to take issue with zero tolerance and have called for the modification of zero tolerance. Despite this groundswell of opinion against zero tolerance, we have the Gun-Free Schools Act that mandates a zero tolerance approach to firearms, and we have in most schools, including most schools in Virginia, an expanded zero tolerance for other types of contraband, drugs, weapons, certain behavior. Actually, I know a school where they have zero tolerance for bullying. You will be expelled from school if you are found to bully. And what I was told is actually the school administrator who told me that didn't want to say what school district it was because he was embarrassed that his school had zero tolerance for bullying. And not surprisingly, the school reports no bullying, okay? Because the teachers don't want to report a child as bullying because they know that child's going to be expelled from school. So this is the problem of zero tolerance, is it forces us or drives us to ignore problems. Now, the Secret Service conducted its own independent study of school shootings with the Federal Department of Education, and they recommended that there be teams in schools that could conduct threat assessments. Well, when the Secret Service and the FBI and the Department of Education all recommended that schools develop threat assessment approach, the school's reaction was, well, what is threat assessment? How do you do it? No one had ever implemented threat assessment procedures because we weren't really familiar with it. So what we decided to do here in the Curry School at the University of Virginia was to try it out. And in fact, we developed a set of guidelines for schools to use, very detailed step-by-step guidelines for what to do when a student is reported to have made some type of threat. And then we field tested these guidelines in 35 schools, that is our local schools, elementary, middle, high, and alternative schools. Okay? This meant we had to do a lot of training. We trained staff, teams in each of these schools in threat assessment. And in each school we had a team, an interdisciplinary team, which schools are of course very comfortable with, and had similar procedures headed up by an administrator with a law enforcement representative and mental health folks. Okay? We had 188 threats that were investigated by our threat assessment teams over the course of the school year. As you can see, we had threats at every grade level, K through 12. And then we asked schools to make a distinction between two basic types of threats. Transient threats, which are most threats, which are threats that are not serious, they're temporary, they're not really true threats, or they're easily resolved if they are. And substantive threats, threats that have substance, threats that imply some danger. Okay? Transient threats might be rhetorical, they might be jokes, they might be expressions of feeling, but the key issue is when the school staff member brings a student in, they're able to resolve the threat through explanation, through apology, through making amends. There's a process of resolution. Okay? On the other hand, if you're having some trouble resolving the threat, the student isn't cooperative, or you think the student is still angry, or you think the student still might want to carry out the threat, we treat the threat as substantive and we take protective action and go further in our decision tree. Okay? In fact, let me jump ahead and say if you're really concerned, if the student has made a threat to kill somebody or commit some other serious felonious act of violence, and you're not able to resolve it through our transient threat assessment process, then we classify it as a very serious substantive threat, and we have a 7-step procedure that we ask folks to go through. Okay? In which they conduct a safety evaluation. A safety evaluation led by or conducted by a multidisciplinary team. Okay? And this threat assessment involves two main components. One is a mental health assessment, and we have details in terms of what you want to evaluate in the child. Many of these kids are, of course, angry, depressed. Some of them have pressing mental health needs. We've had cases like this where the child is needed to be hospitalized. But we also have cases where the child doesn't need to be hospitalized, but maybe the child is a victim of bullying or is involved in some type of peer conflict that he or she isn't able to resolve, and we can come up with recommendations for resolving that issue or conflict. Okay? So it's a problem-oriented mental health assessment aimed to try to understand where did this threat come from and what can we do to resolve it. Now, in these very serious cases, we also have a parallel companion evaluation by law enforcement, by the school resource officer. There may be violations of law. There may be legal steps that need to be taken. So we have both a law and mental health approach to the very serious substantive threats. The team then pools the results of these two evaluations and comes up with an action plan for the student. Is the student going to be removed from school? If so, how long and what alternative setting? Under what conditions are we able to maybe bring the student back to school, assuming we're eventually able to resolve the threat and deal with the risk of violence? Okay? So we did this with our 188 cases. Most of them, 70% of them were transient, 30% of them were substantive, and only about 15 cases required the entire elaborate process that I briefly mentioned. But this is what our students threatened to do. As you can see, the most common thing that a student threatens to do is to hit somebody or beat somebody up. Okay? But we had 27 threats to kill, which a student said, I'm going to kill you. Okay? We had threats to shoot, I'm going to shoot you, or I'm going to bust a cap, or whatever the common parlance might be. We had vague threats like, I'm going to get you, I'm going to hurt you. We had all kinds of threats, and we had some bomb threats as well. Okay? So these are all the different things that the students threatened to do, and then they were handled with our threat assessment approach. And the result was 6 of these cases resulted in a child who was arrested. Okay? Now the arrest involved bomb threats, which are illegal, a child who had a knife at school and had threatened to stab somebody and was arrested for the possession of the knife. And we had 2 children who were arrested for assaulting the school resource officer, which turns out to really be the quickest way to get arrested in school is to assault the school resource officer. That will work every time. Only 3 students were expelled. Out of 188 cases, only 3 students were expelled. So if we'd had 0 tolerance, we certainly would have had a lot more expulsions than that. We had 94 students who received some type of suspension from school, typically 1 to 3 day suspensions. These weren't long-term suspensions. Okay. We then interviewed the principals at the end of the school year. We did a follow-up, and we asked them, what about the students' behavior during the rest of the school year? What happened to them? We found that 1 in 5 got worse in their behavior and continued to be quite difficult. We found that about 40% were the same and about 40% improved in their behavior. Now, we don't suggest that threat assessment is sort of the cure for students with disciplinary problems. Some of them continued to have disciplinary problems. But we did find that threat assessment didn't really seem to hurt. And of course, the question you might be wondering is, well, did they carry out any of these threats? Now, we had 27 threats to kill. Obviously, none of those children were killed. We had threats to shoot. There weren't any shootings. In fact, we went back to the principals. We interviewed them and said, was the threat carried out? They said no. So as far as we know, none of these threats were carried out. We've done this. Memphis Public Schools actually has done a threat assessment. They just sent me their report they did a year of threat assessment. None of their threats were carried out as well. So we certainly need more than just our field study. It was 35 schools. We looked at it over the course of a year, but we need controlled studies. We need comparison groups of schools that aren't using threat assessment that we can compare side by side. But I have to tell you, we do have an ongoing study with the school division that has 20 schools that we examined last spring before they did threat assessment training, and we looked at their suspension and expulsion rates. And they now have done threat assessment training, and we're now following these 20 schools over the course of this school year to see how they're doing using threat assessment. And we also have some comparison schools in an unnamed school district who are going to have training in the future, but we're using them as a comparison group right now. So we hope that this will give us a controlled study, quasi-experimental design study. We have, however, done a lot of experience in training schools in threat assessment, and they have been reporting data, very positive data to us about their implementation of threat assessment. We've to date trained over 24 school divisions in Virginia in threat assessment. We've also trained school divisions in many other states. And we're also trying to look at this on a statewide basis. We're trying to look at school policies like zero tolerance, like having threat assessment, as a number of our school divisions do, to see if that makes a difference statewide. So recently we received a federal grant to start a high school study. Ann Gregory, Fan, and Peter Sherris and I are investigators in this study that's going to look at the high school policies and practices in Virginia and their impact on expulsions, suspensions, and incidents of violence. Okay? We're going to include in our study random samples of students and teachers from each of Virginia's 300 high schools. We've chosen 9th grade as our target group because 9th graders have more discipline problems than any other grade. And also this gives us an opportunity to look at 9th grade as they move through the years. But we're going to get a random sample from each high school of 9th graders and their teachers, because we want both teacher and student perceptions of safety in the school and of the school climate in general. We're going to have an online survey, which we're in the process of developing and piloting, that's going to look at the understanding of school discipline rules that students have, their experiences of being teased or bullied, and their overall perception of the school climate as supportive or not. Okay? And basically then we expect this will help us understand how engaged they are in school and in the learning process. Okay? What we hope to learn, and I'm summarizing a lot here, is whether zero tolerance will improve school safety. We're also going to see whether there is a sort of an optimal combination of structure and support. We have the notion that if a school is very highly structured, you might reach a point in which students become resistive and become opposed to the structure. But perhaps if you have an adequate level of support, the students will be tolerant of the structure. So we think there might be sort of a middle range of structure and support that is tolerable to students and optimal for a positive school climate. We're also going to be comparing schools across populations. That is, we're going to be looking at neighborhood crime and neighborhood poverty, because certainly schools have different populations to deal with, and it may be that the level of structure and support you need for optimal school safety is going to vary as a function of the student population. Our goal, of course, is to see can we reduce suspensions and expulsions, and along with that the incidents of violence that lead to suspensions and expulsions in our schools. Okay. Thank you very much.